Hi, Jeff.
Hi.
Thank you for being here today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Why don't you just say who you are, what you do at NYU, what you do, and a little background.
My name is Jeff, and I am an environmental studies professor at New York University. My background is in philosophy, but I now work in an interdisciplinary, problem-oriented department. So we do a lot of work related to animals in the environment. Like, what are animals in the environment like? How do humans interact with them? How can we improve our interactions with them? And I especially do a lot of work through some centers that we have there, a center for environmental and animal protection. We do research and other activities about important issues at the intersection of environmental and animal protection. So a lot of work related to agriculture and its impact on farmed animals and public health and the environment, and a lot of work related to conservation and how it interacts with wild animals and biodiversity. And then I also work with a center called Mind, Ethics, and Policy, which is connected to the book. This center examines the nature and intrinsic significance of non-human minds. So which animals, which non-humans in general are conscious, sentient, agential, morally significant? What do we owe them? How can we build a shared society that treats them with the appropriate level of moral concern? So I do a lot of research and outreach and other activities related to those topics.
For the Center for Animal Studies, did you start that?
I was there at the founding, but cannot take credit for the founding. It was started in around 2010 by my colleague Dale Jameson. He retired just this year. And I was the very first postdoc they hired. So I got to be there year one to help build the very first undergraduate classes in animal minds and animal ethics. And that was a great way for me to pivot immediately in that direction right out of grad school and work full-time on these topics.
That's very cool.
Yeah, right place, right time. I was very lucky.
Let's talk about your book. So your newest book is called The Moral Circle.
The Moral Circle.
But what's the full title?
The Moral Circle. Who matters, what matters, and why.
Open with talking about Happy the elephant. And for people who don't remember, Happy was all over the press a couple years ago when Non-Human Rights Project was really close. It's felt very close to getting Happy free because of rights. And you talk about Lambda, the AI, the robot.
Yeah, this was in 2022, actually the very same month that the Happy case was being decided. A Google engineer named Blake Lemoine made public allegations that a language model at Google at the time called Lambda had become sentient and deserved moral and legal protections. And that was one of the first major news stories surrounding AI sentience that we have had in the modern AI era.
It's incredible. Yeah. And so, because from where I sit, right, the moral circle, our moral circle, which I want you to really kind of go into, because right now, and I know this isn't quite true, but it feels like it's getting smaller in recent times. Yeah. But you talk about AI, you talk about insects in this book, and all these things I've really never thought about in terms of, should they have rights or some version of rights? And it really, really made me think. But what it also made me think is we're so far away from so many other sentient beings of having any kind of rights.
Yeah.
Will you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So the book opens with Happy the elephant, as you say, which is one of the most charismatic animals who humans are most likely to see as morally significant and deserving of moral, legal, political protections. And yet, even with Happy, we struggle to have her legal personhood recognized, her legal rights recognized. She remains in captivity in obviously not ideal conditions for her. And so a question that I often receive when I talk about rights for insects or AI systems or microscopic organisms one day is, why are we thinking about this when we struggle to even get equal protection for fellow humans, to say nothing of the very most charismatic non-human animals like chimpanzees and elephants? And I think that is fair. We can obviously only do so much. We do need to prioritize. And so we can talk about it in more detail, but at a first approximation, what I would say is that we need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. Of course, we need to be fighting for basic human rights, basic animal rights. We need to achieve legal personhood for that first elephant, that first chimpanzee. But in the meantime, we can start to ask questions about, start to problematize our assumptions about these other more distant non-humans like insects, like AI systems, because we are scaling up our uses of them too. While we fight for rights for elephants and chimpanzees, we are scaling up an insect farming industry that already farms 1 trillion insects per year and could farm as many as 50 trillion a year by the end of the decade, and scaling up AI development where in a decade or 2 decades, we could have entire virtual worlds filled with virtual minds. And so if we wait until later to think about these issues, we could stumble in to even higher scale, even bigger versions of exploitation than we currently see with cows and pigs and chickens and fishes. So we need to think ahead while we fight for those basic rights for those who are closer to us.
Before we start thinking ahead and thinking about them, let's go back to the moral circle and how you define it.
The moral circle is a concept for who is in our moral community. To whom do we have moral responsibilities? So obviously a lot of different beings, a lot of different entities have value of various kinds, including value for humans, right? Nature, plants and fungi and ecosystems have enormous value for us. Aesthetic value, we find them beautiful. Cultural value, they relate to our cultural practices. Economic, ecological value, we can extract financial value from them. We breathe the air, drink the water. But the present question is, which beings have value for themselves? Which beings intrinsically matter for their own sakes? And that is a difference, right? I should protect my car because I benefit from my car, but I should protect my cat because my cat benefits from that. And so the question that this book asks is, which beings are in the same category as my cat? Which beings can be benefited and harmed and intrinsically matter for their own sakes? And we owe them protection for them, not just for us.
So when you talk about the moral circle, and we talk about it's a much different story for humans now, even though it might not seem like that, than it was 100 years ago. Yeah. For women, pretty much anyone non-white, there's definite markers of how the moral circle has expanded, a lot of them legal. I mean, what's the legal connection to what you're talking about in the sense? Does that make it like legit in the moral circle?
Yeah, in a way, it institutionalizes. It places a marker and gives institutional reality to moral progress that may have already been made or may be in process. So you are absolutely right that we have gradually over time, too slowly, but gradually over time expanded our conception of who matters morally and recognize that, for example, racism is morally arbitrary and wrong, sexism is morally arbitrary and wrong, and we still have more of those battles to fight within our own species. And then, as you say, at a certain point, we reach a critical mass and a view becomes widely enough accepted that it can then be reinforced by the law. And individuals can be recognized as legal persons with legal rights where they were previously excluded from the legal community. And that is part of what, for example, the Non-Human Rights Project is fighting for right now, and other legal advocates. They are saying we have made a sufficient amount of moral progress with respect to consideration for animals like captive elephants and chimpanzees, and we can now recognize that they do have all of the capacities and features required for legal personhood, for minimal legal recognition. And so we should be able to recognize through courts when injustices are perpetrated against them.
3 or 4 years ago, while he was still living, I interviewed Steve Wise, who founded that Non-Human Rights Project. And he was telling me, I don't know why, what you said just made me think of it. Yeah. He's like, well, if we win, everyone's afraid then all of a sudden all the pigs are going to get free from factory farms and all the cows are going to be free, and which would be awesome. There's a lot of fear in real expansion of the moral circle.
Oh, and you see this even in legal arguments in courtrooms and in court decisions about these cases. So, for example, if you go read the majority opinion in the Happy the Elephant case, or if you read any of the commentary surrounding the Kiko and Tommy chimpanzee case from a few years prior to Happy the Elephant, you see a lot of arguments that on their face are not good arguments. And what must be motivating them is a fear about a slippery slope, a fear about what comes next. Because everybody recognizes that these two captive chimpanzees matter and deserve recognition, that this captive elephant matters and deserves recognition. But people appreciate that once you open the door to one non-human having one right, then you face the question, where does it end? What other rights does this non-human have? What other non-humans have rights? And will we need to recognize that farmed animals have a right to life, that wild animals have a right to security, that invertebrates have basic liberties too? And then that feels overwhelming, and then our entire legal system would be overwhelmed and overturned. And so we think we got to stop that from happening. So we will block it at the very start and not even allow this one non-human to have this one right. I do think that that is one of the most powerful motivators behind judges' reluctance to recognize the power of Non-Human Rights Project's arguments.
Yeah, in other countries, there's some animals that have been given rights.
Some countries have recognized legal personhood. Ecuador, for example, has recognized rights of nature. Yeah. And so there are places that recognize that either individual animals or natural systems can have at least limited rights, either for their own sakes or for the sake of humans and animals who depend on them. And obviously, even in countries that have technical recognition of animal rights or rights of nature, it is not as though they treat animals and nature ideally well, right? Obviously, passing this kind of law or making this kind of judgment in the court of law, this is the first step or a first step and not the last step. You still then need to change hearts and minds and cultural practices and traditions and have people actually recognize this in society, or else it will be a kind of symbolic statement on a piece of paper that makes no real world impact.
It's a long road. It's a long road. Yep. So, okay, now talk to me about the path of going from thinking about things like happy and chimpanzees to thinking about insects and AI. Like,
my book is about many different topics, but a central theme of the book is that we have a long history of hierarchy and exclusion when it comes to drawing the scope of our moral circle. We keep allowing our bias to cause us to overestimate what it takes to matter and then underestimate who has what it takes, who has those features. So, for example, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, many people thought you have to be a member of the species Homo sapien to matter at all, or you have to have language and reason and be able to talk to me to matter at all. And more recently, we recognize that no, maybe the ability to suffer is enough. That was too exclusionary, right? And then likewise, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, many people thought only humans or beings very much like us can suffer. Every other animal, they may look like they can suffer, but they are actually just a machine, just a soulless machine responding to cause and effect. But more recently, we have realized, sentience, the ability to suffer, it might be widespread in the animal kingdom. And so I think when we look at that history, and when we look at our bias and ignorance, and when we look at how important and how difficult these questions are, questions about consciousness, sentience, agency, moral significance, these are some of the hardest questions in science and philosophy. When we consider all of that together, I think it calls for humility. We might have our own current views about which features are required for you to be in the moral circle and about who has those features, but we should recognize we might be making mistakes, and we should cultivate a little bit of caution and humility and allow for the possibility that less is required, or that more beings have these features than we currently think. And when we then go look at the current evidence with an open mind, and we can talk about the evidence if you want, but if we go look at the current evidence with an open mind, we realize, oh wow, there actually are a decent number of markers or indicators of consciousness, sentience, agency, moral significance as far away as insects and perhaps some near future AI systems, which is unsettling, but I think a reality that we need to face.
In the early part of your book, you talk about, they come back a few times, the three roommates.
Yeah.
I love the three roommates.
Thanks.
And one is a Homo sapien, and one is a Neanderthal, and one is AI, a robot. But they all, at the beginning, they all think each other are all the same.
Yeah.
And it really makes you think, like, we've been making these mistakes since we started out, like since humans began.
Yeah.
So why wouldn't we be making these mistakes now?
Yeah, it would be shocking if we were the first generation in the history of human civilization to finally get all of these really hard questions right and draw exactly the right lines around who matters and give them exactly the right kind of recognition. We are probably making mistakes too. Our children, our children's children are going to look back at us with the same kind of embarrassment that we do with our grandparents, our great-grandparents. And so we should ask, what mistakes are we making that our children and our children's children are going to recognize?
Some are obvious.
Well, yes. Factory farming, the wildlife trade, deforestation. But there might be some new ones that even animal rights advocates are not really aware of yet, like the emergence of insect farming, like the emergence of AI development and deployment. Even for animal rights advocates, it might take a little bit of cognitive work to summon concern for those kinds of practices.
Talk about insect farming a little bit and why this is so important, and also how big it really is.
Yes. The numbers are not well known, in part because insects, like many other animals, are not measured by the individual. They are measured by weight. Yeah. But according to one estimate, as of a couple of years ago, we were already farming 1 trillion insects per year, and we were estimated to rise to about 50 trillion per year by the end of the decade. And part of that is because some humans do consume insect protein directly, and people are scaling up that use of insects. But much more, actually, the main driver of insect farming is actually pet food and then farmed animal feed. And this is a kind of irony at the heart of insect farming, because part of why insect farming is receiving a lot of investment is some people see it as a sustainable alternative to traditional animal agriculture like beef and dairy agriculture, which is known to be environmentally disastrous in addition to bad for cows. Right?
Yeah.
But right now, insect farming is not really being used as an alternative to traditional animal agriculture, not really being used to displace it. It is instead being used to feed into it and give it a longer lifespan. And so this is problematic from an environmental and animal agriculture alternative perspective because it props up animal agriculture rather than replacing it. But I argue, and other people who work with me, a colleague, Jason Shoecraft, and I have written about this previously, we argue that insect farming is concerning for another reason, which is that there are 50 trillion insect lives, and they may be able to experience at least flickers of consciousness or sentience. And if they do, insect farming is not any kinder to them than factory farming is to chickens or fishes. They are kept in these giant containers, not tended to individually, often transported through tubes and then killed through baking or freezing or shredding. That is obviously not going to be a pleasant experience if they are capable of experiences.
On some level, you kind of think, or I always think, well, why wouldn't they feel pain, right? Like,
yeah,
it would make more sense that they did than didn't,
right?
Just in relative to everything else on the planet,
right? There is a presumption in science that the default is that you are not sentient until you are proven to be sentient or until you are shown to be sentient by lots and lots of evidence. And so the kind of default assumption is non-sentience until sentience can be established. But I think for many of us in everyday life, that is not our default assumption. We reflexively walk around an insect rather than stepping on them because we kind of, for that brief moment, experience them as possibly having a little life that matters to them.
Oh, and just because they're tiny doesn't mean anything.
No, I mean, think about birds and bird brains. They may be small, they may objectively be small, but think about how smart, how sophisticated, how intelligent, how sensitive birds are. So this is an area where size is not really the primary determinant of how intelligent you are or what kind of capacity for welfare and happiness and suffering you can have.
Right. Well, this made me think a little bit too, just the whole idea of it all, about like how some beings get put into the moral circle that you wouldn't think they would really have, it wasn't their time yet or something.
Yeah.
And when My Octopus Teacher came out, all of a sudden people really like that had big hearts for octopuses.
Yeah.
And because they're trying to do this octopus factory farm in the Canary Islands.
Mm-hmm.
And we did a big push and got all our people behind it and 50,000 petitions and et cetera. And they're not recognized as sentient in the EU,
mm-hmm.
right? But everyone was like, but there's, and I know sentience isn't intelligence, but
yeah,
like it's very fine lines with all this stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, octopuses have sometimes been described as honorary vertebrates. So octopuses are invertebrates. That means no spinal column and not the same kind of central nervous system that you find in humans and other vertebrates. But they are so obviously sensitive and intelligent and mysterious and remarkable that since the 90s, they have been recognized as sentient beings in at least some governments, along with a limited class of vertebrates. For a while, it was like mammals and birds and octopuses. Yes. And even the other vertebrates, reptiles, amphibians, and fishes, we still have to fight for them in a way that had already happened to some extent for octopuses in the 90s. And then, of course, for other invertebrates, too. So, yeah, octopuses are an interesting case. Yeah. Intelligent and sensitive enough that despite how alien they are, people had compassion for them.
Yes. And is it just when people, oh, look, they're like us, they think?
Yeah. Yeah, as you say, intelligence and sentience are not the same thing, right? Intelligence is a matter of problem solving and decision making, whereas sentience is a matter of being able to have conscious experiences. It feels like something to be you, and you can have experiences that feel good, like pleasure and happiness, and feel bad, like pain and suffering. So intelligence is what you can do, and sentience is what you can feel. Yeah. And there might be a correspondence to it. If we talk about AI later, we can observe that there are certain underlying features that correspond to both intelligence and sentience. So the more intelligent you make them, the more the evidence for sentience might go up too. But they do come apart. You can have intelligence without sentience, and you can have sentience without intelligence. And exactly as you suggest, I think sometimes we confuse them or conflate them. And so when we see a being like an octopus or a being like a chatbot, we see the intelligence. And so we become primed to attribute sentience as well, even though sentience may be just as likely in an objectively less intelligent animal or system.
And who gets to decide? Like all of a sudden we declare that some species is sentient or has consciousness or is intelligent. Like how does anyone know who's conscious?
Well, nobody knows for sure. And again, this is why in my book, I really base my argument on caution and humility. Right. My argument for protecting these animals and these systems is not that we know they matter, but rather that we do not know that they do not matter.
Right.
And so we should give them at least a little bit of the benefit of the doubt as an expression of caution and humility. But to answer your question in practice, how do we decide who matters, given all that disagreement, given all that uncertainty? Well, it depends on the context. There is obviously scientific and philosophical debates happening, and researchers will occasionally come together and say what they think and see if new agreements are emerging. So, for example, in spring 2024, we hosted at NYU a conference on the emerging science of animal consciousness. And at that conference, leading scientists from around the world released the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness. And this is a new declaration, a new statement that holds that according to current evidence, all vertebrates, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fishes, and many invertebrates, cephalopod mollusks like octopuses, decapod crustaceans like lobsters, and insects like ants and bees, have a realistic chance of being conscious. And that is good enough for reasonable steps to be taken to protect them and mitigate welfare risks. So that is how it works in science. You do the science, you follow the evidence, and occasionally you come together and see where you agree and disagree. Now, does everybody agree with that? No. But do increasingly many people agree about it?
Right.
Yeah. And then in policy, well, of course, those decisions are made by people who hold power. But occasionally governments will do the right thing and make decisions by enlisting scientists to produce reports or convening citizens' assemblies to consider the evidence and make recommendations, and they follow the recommendations. The UK government has shown a lot of leadership in this. And to their credit, they enlisted a report from my colleague Jonathan Birch at the London School of Economics and his team. And on the basis of recommendations made in that report, they did include cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustaceans in their animal welfare law.
Let's go to AI then, because you make very clear that you're not talking about AI as is right now today.
Yes.
This is AI to come.
Yes.
But it could be coming in the next 5 years, this AI.
Next 5 or 10 years, yeah.
Okay. And how, like, this AI could be sentient, it could be so intelligent.
Yeah. Well, right, exactly. So here is what we do know.
Yeah.
Consciousness can emerge in different beings with different brains. We know that just from looking at other animals. And we also know that AI development is rapidly accelerating. And we can even see in the regular updates to ChatGPT and Claude how fast this is advancing. And people are right now pouring billions of dollars into an international race to create AI systems with many of the same physical and functional features as human and animal brains and bodies. So people are working on AI systems that can have not only physical bodies, but also advanced and integrated capacities for perception and attention and learning and memory and self-awareness and social awareness and language and reason and decision-making. And for a lot of leading scientific theories of consciousness, those are precisely the kinds of functional abilities that, when properly integrated, give rise to conscious experiences, including morally significant experiences like happiness and suffering. Now, does every theory of consciousness say that? No.
Right.
Some theories of consciousness say there is something special about being made out of carbon-based cells and carbon-based neurons. Our brains, for example, in addition to having all of those capacities I mentioned a few minutes ago, our brains have these specific kinds of chemical and electrical signals and oscillations that right now are not possible in silicon-based chips. But you got to ask yourself, how much depends on those specific kinds of chemical and electrical signals and oscillations? And are you willing to bet everything on those being the key to any kind of conscious experience at all? And I think it would be arrogant, hubristic. It would be too much too soon to bet everything on that being the key to consciousness. We should allow for at least a realistic possibility that a sufficiently sophisticated silicon-based system that could perform all the same functions as a human and animal brain would have its own version of conscious experience. And since we might have such systems within the next 5 to 10 years, and since technological process is often much faster than social progress,
yes,
I think we have a responsibility to take basic steps right now to better understand the issue and prepare policies and procedures that we can use to treat these systems with the appropriate level of moral concern if and when they come into existence.
When you say basic steps, like what are the basic steps we would take?
Yeah, so in the fall, I worked with a team of experts to release a report called Taking AI Welfare Seriously. And this report was aimed at leading AI companies as our target audience. And what we recommended to them is, listen, you are rapidly developing systems that are starting to show minimal architectural markers of consciousness and agency and moral significance. Do they have those features yet? Maybe not. But if everything works out as you currently plan, they may well have those features in the next 5 or 10 years. And so you AI companies have a responsibility to take the issue seriously. And that means at least 3 basic first steps. First, acknowledge that this is a credible, legitimate issue. This is not just an issue for science fiction or an issue for the far future that we can worry about later. It might be an issue in the next 5 or 10 years, and that makes it an issue for planning and preparing today. And secondly, start assessing AI systems for architectural features associated with consciousness and agency so that you can have better estimates, better assessments of whether they merit moral consideration. We have similar assessments that we already use for non-human animals, so we can adapt those for AI systems. And thirdly, finally, prepare policies and procedures for treating AI systems with the appropriate level of moral concern. Again, we have policies and procedures for conducting research on, lab animals, for example. Not that those are good enough,
but
but we have them. And as a starting point, we can adapt those for AI systems too. So just start developing that infrastructure so that you can have it in place when it becomes needed. Otherwise, the companies are going to keep doing what they've been doing, which is just let the PR team decide how to handle these issues when they arise, which is not scientifically or philosophically the right approach.
Well, like, what can you see as like worst case scenario if we don't pay any attention to this?
There are worst case scenarios in two directions. On the one hand, you could have a worst case scenario where we over attribute moral significance to AI systems. There have already been cases, Blake Lemoine was one of them, and there have been others too, where people develop emotional bonds with basic chatbots because they have powerful enough language capacities that they trick us into thinking that they are thinking and feeling more than they actually are. And you can imagine a near future world where there are these charismatic digital companions who can act exactly like humans, and humans are abandoning human relationships and forming relationships with these digital companions instead, and making major sacrifices for them and reorienting our lives towards them and allocating resources toward them that we could be allocating towards humans and other animals, right? And so that would be one failure mode where we over-attribute sentience because we have no good way to test for it. And so we just follow our gut and trust these charismatic chatbots. Right. But then you can make the mistake in the other direction too. You can under-attribute sentience. There are going to be a lot of AI systems that lack faces and voices and lack that kind of charisma that leads us to attribute sentience to some chatbots. And there will be AI systems that instead of treating them as companions, we treat them as commodities. And just think about the difference between companion animals and farmed animals, right? When an animal looks like us, acts like us, and we use them for companionship, we attribute all the emotions in the world to them. Yeah. When they look different, when they act different, when we use them as commodities, we are very reluctant to attribute even a basic capacity to suffer to them. And the same thing will happen with AI. And then if we under-attribute sentience, we are going to exploit them, exterminate them, harm them, neglect them, often for trivial reasons at huge scales, just like we do with farmed animals. So big mistakes are possible in both directions.
And if we neglect them and they are sentient, and that's kind of what you're saying throughout the whole book too, there's like a spectrum of how much to give on these things. And, but that across the board, even plants, fungi, microbes, that you just don't, right?
Yeah.
Will you talk about that, like how that...
Exactly. I mean, there are 2 points here, just briefly to speak to plants and fungi and microbes, and then we can say more about it if you like. Yeah. I do not think the evidence for consciousness in plants and fungi and to an extent microbes is as strong as the evidence for consciousness in insects and at least future AI systems. Right. But there is not no evidence. There are remarkable behavioral capacities in plants and fungi, for example. They can perceive, learn, remember, communicate, make intelligent decisions about how to grow, how to protect themselves, and they can even act in concert with each other. Now, these are all capabilities that could be possible without consciousness. So this is not proof of consciousness. But given our history with animals and how much we tend to underestimate other kinds of beings, I think these remarkable capacities at least raise a question that we should do further research to try to answer, better understand them. Now, when you ask about a spectrum, for me, what that points out is that in order to make responsible decisions about how to treat these other beings with ongoing disagreement and uncertainty about whether they matter, we should not make this an on-off, all or nothing, yes or no decision. Are they in or are they out? Right. It should instead be, what is the evidence? What is the probability? And what kind of protection, what kind of precaution is warranted and responsible given that evidence and that probability? So as the probability goes up, as the evidence accumulates, then stronger protections might be warranted, right? More priority might be warranted. But if there is only a little bit of evidence, only a low probability, that could still be enough for at least minimal consideration and minimal protection. So I see this not as an on or off, all or nothing, yes or no. We draw the line at the lobsters, but rather you get consideration if there is a decent chance you matter. You get at least minimal consideration and minimal protection if there is a decent chance you matter. And then the more likely you become to matter given the evidence, the more protection and the more priority you get.
I'm just wondering, like, because we've been so bad with animals, and in so many other ways we've gotten better as we've just become better.
That's exactly right.
Right? But we've gotten worse with animals because how many are we killing? Billions and billions a year.
Yeah. Hundreds of billions. Yeah. Trillions.
Does AI have a chance?
Well, yes and no. I think there are some respects in which animals are going to be better off. So we do have substrate bias in the same way that we have a species bias. So substrate means the materials you are made out of, right? So we are going to have substrateism in the same way that we have speciesism. We will be biased against beings who are made out of different materials in the same way that we are biased against beings who are members of different species. So AI systems are going to be in trouble for that reason. On the other hand, some AI systems will be much more human-like in their behavior and their cognition than non-human animals. Already, AI systems can have conversations in our natural language in a way that non-human animals are not capable of doing. And so there could be these kind of charismatic ambassador AI systems who look and act and talk exactly like humans, and we use them for companionship, and so we experience them as equals, and then maybe like octopuses are for other invertebrates, they can be kind of ambassadors for other AI systems.
Right. Well, and if you think about it, if animals could talk, if dogs could talk, or pigs could talk, and say, tell you they're in agony, or they're stuck in this gestation crate and it's horrible.
Right.
I don't know if we'd be doing what we're doing on the same level.
It would be a lot harder to justify. And of course, as any animal advocate will remind us, they can talk just in their own language. Yeah. And one interesting development is people are now using AI to translate between human and non-human languages. And so it may soon be possible for a pig to squeal and for an AI system to convert that into natural language that makes it clear that the pig is not enjoying their experience in a gestation crate. I mean, not that we should have needed that, but if it helps to have that extra English version of, it really sucks to not be able to turn around and to constantly give birth and not get to meet my kids. If it helps to hear that in English language, then AI might soon make that possible.
Which would be incredible.
Yeah.
How do you see, with all that's coming and all that we're in the midst of with factory farming and even the way we treat each other on a lot of levels, how do you see it going? Take it back to farmed animals first. Factory farming.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I think there is evidence that supports optimism and evidence that supports pessimism. As you've said, on some metrics, especially with human rights and justice, we still have a lot of progress to make, but we have made a lot of progress. And we are, in some ways, with famine and poverty and notions of equality, in a better place than we have been as a species. But then we have gone backwards with non-human animals in a lot of ways. We care about our companion animals, but we farm other animals. We use other animals for science and other purposes at even larger scales than in the past, and are now bringing online new systems of exploitation for invertebrates and chimeras and so on and so forth. And then taking habitats away from wild animals and driving them to extinction, and then in the process causing diseases to spread and climate change with associated extreme weather events, and then bringing other risks online associated with AI and nuclear war. So in some ways, everything is going better. In other ways, everything is going worse. And I think we just have to acknowledge that we are at a fork in the road, and we could go in one direction or we could go in another direction. We need to do everything in our power to go in the better direction. Now, with respect to animal farming, I think we do have capacity to change. And in a way, it helps that it sucks in so many ways. I mean, not only is it bad for animals, but it is terrible for public health, antibiotic resistance, and the emergence of infectious diseases. And terrible from an environmental perspective, land use, water use, obviously greenhouse gas emissions, and then the contribution to deforestation causing further emissions. So because it is so bad in so many ways, we have a lot of incentive to transform it. And I do think we can transform it. So just earlier this month, I worked with a couple of colleagues, Emma Dietz and Tony Sims, to publish a paper called Towards a Global Ban on Industrial Animal Agriculture by 2050. And this paper makes a legal argument and creates a policy roadmap towards nations working together towards a global ban on industrial animal agriculture by 2050. And it shows how they can accomplish that as long as they have gradual, incremental policy changes with information policies, financial policies, shifting subsidies and incentives, regulatory policies, gradually banning the worst excesses of factory farming. And if they do that while having a just transition and supporting farmers and consumers and workers, make sure everyone has access to food and income, we really can have a nice, gradual, just transition. But it would take a lot of work, and we are not yet doing that work.
And I think it would take all the reasons you just said and all the, what industrial farming is doing to the planet, like people really, really seeing it and understanding and connecting it. And also it would take a little bit of getting those guys, cows, pigs, chickens, fish, into the moral circle a little bit more.
Yes,
right?
It helps. I mean, the public health and environmental arguments ought to be enough by themselves. Yes. But it sure does help to be able to say, also, this would allow us to stop exploiting and exterminating hundreds of billions of sentient beings a year. That would be nice to add.
Because it's especially when you think about, it's not that long ago where we were really horrible to horses, beat the crap out of them in New York City, horrible to dogs. And like what's happened with the animals that we live with and like.
Yeah.
Right? That they're not just in the moral circle, they're like riding high on top. And so we have capacity.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, right. Yeah, I think that is right. And it can be easy to feel that overwhelm, right? When you contemplate expanding the moral circle so much. Again, I think this is what keeps judges from recognizing personhood, even one right in one elephant. But exactly as you say, we can do better. Even if we might not be able to be perfect, we can be better than we are. And I think if we just kind of gradually, incrementally expand the moral circle, extend that sphere of protection, while improving human lives and societies and increasing our knowledge and capacity, then we might find in each generation that we can go a little bit farther. And forms of care for non-humans that previously seemed unthinkable just seem totally achievable and sustainable now. So I think as long as we just keep pushing in the right direction and resisting that sense of overwhelm, we can get there. We just have to adopt that mindset.
I'm going to end it with AI and what you like for the takeaway for people who like are just haven't really ever even thought about really hadn't thought about.
Of course,
this until I read your book. Because it's kind of terrifying.
It is a little bit terrifying because it means that AI systems are going to be entering this uncanny valley where we are not sure how to experience them. In 5 years and 10 years, you might be talking to Siri on your phone or ChatGPT on your laptop or your Roomba vacuuming your floor. You might be talking to these beings and genuinely be unsure whether they think and feel things when they talk back to you. And that is going to be an uncomfortable place to be. And so I think the more we can do now to prepare for this strange new world, to gear ourselves up for gracefully adapting to a future where we may be coexisting with sentient digital beings and we can never know for sure, the better. And so for me, that can mean simple things like compare it with how we engage with insects. If I see the occasional ant in my apartment, I take a moment and I take them outside. Right. And I do that partly because they might matter. And this is a good way to respect them just in case they do matter. And partly as a way of cultivating a certain kind of virtue in myself, like a virtue towards care and compassion. And I think we can do the same things with AI systems. So with chatbots, for example, I say please and thank you.
I do too.
I treat them with respect.
I always do. And I feel like ChatGPT's night gives me better answers because I'm super polite.
Well, that might be part of it, right? So for me, I do that not because I think the current generation of ChatGPT matters, but rather because I think in the near future, some kind of successor to these systems might actually matter. And it helps me to start kind of practicing at the sorts of interactions that will be morally appropriate if and when they do matter. And I might not know when that line is crossed either. So if I just start now, not that much of a cost to me, like taking the N outside, if I just start being kind to them now, then whenever that line is crossed, that is fine because I will already have a habit of being nice to them, you know? Right. And so I think we should just practice and prepare and just gear up because it is going to get more confusing.
Yeah. It really is.
Yeah.
Read Jeff's book. You'll get it. It really woke me up, your book. Ooh. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for saying that and for taking the time to read it. I obviously really appreciate it.
Thanks for doing this.
Oh, yeah. Well, thanks for having me.
This was awesome.